Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. I'm here with my co-host Kate Riga, and we're still in this kind of season of discontent here. Got a lot of things happening now. Well, there's kind of two or three different moving parts that we're going to talk about today, but they're all obviously interrelated. And one thing that happened, in last week's podcast, we were talking about this whole debt ceiling thing, and we were having kind of a conversation about uh, did McConnell blink or did he not blink, and all this kind of stuff. And then suddenly it was resolved. I don't know if it was Thursday or Friday. I can't really remember. It doesn't really matter. But we know how that um, came out. And then we had the little sort of faux blow up about the mean speech that Chuck Schumer was mean, and I did a post about this. I think people there's a whole thing where Democrats live inside the to far too great a degree live inside the DC press conventional wisdom, and it hurts them a lot. So in any case, today there's a few different things we're going to talk about. You got the January 6th committee thing hopefully moving forward. Is a lot of Democrats, a lot of people who want us to still be a democracy. I should be a little more direct and clear about this. We're starting to get a sense of deja vu, back to impeachment, both impeachments, or the whole drama about the president's tax returns, where you get a subpoena or you have a lawful right to ask something or blah 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 blah, and the Trump people just say no. And you have the Congress or whoever it is kind of, okay, what do we do now? They said no. And you go to the courts. Well, we saw this with impeachment. President can basically say, or actually before impeachment, if a president wants to make all sorts of frivolous complaints and challenges, president can just kick the can down the road to where nothing happens. So they don't have to win anything. They can just kind of gum it up forever. And then during the second, I lose track of the impeachments. They kind of flow together in my mind. But I guess this was actually both. But I guess this was actually more the first Trump impeachment, where remember back when we were in that period where it's not so much the left or the progressives, the more aggressive Democrats in Congress were saying, you have to start an impeachment inquiry because otherwise people don't think you're serious. And B, you don't have as much claim vis-a-vis the courts. When you're just doing oversight, that's one standard. But when you kind of, when you bring out the big I, the impeachment word, suddenly you got all sorts of power. Well, they did that and the president still said no. So you have a lot of people feeling, a either deja vu or kind of democratic process PTSD about what's going on here. But as I have tried to explain in a few posts, for better or worse, our system puts a lot of obstacles in the way of compelling things from a sitting president. That's just the reality. The president can abuse those things, and President Trump did, but that's a reality. And we can't even really blame the Constitution exactly, because the Constitution creates a remedy for a lawless president, for a president who is sort of renegade within the Constitution. You impeach him and you remove him from office. Those founders guys, they covered this. They had something for this. And Congress, we can say it's Republicans, but the reality is Congress had two shots at that, and they didn't do it. But the key is that an ex-president has virtually none of those powers, none of those obstacles between him and someone trying to investigate him or his cronies or his co-conspirators or whatever. So we're kind of coming down to pretty quick a decision. We're going to see whether this committee is really for real. Are they going to do this thing where kind of, some of the president's cronies basically just say no, and they're uh that's too bad, or that they're kind of engaging and they kind of run out the clock for whatever. So we're going to talk about that. That's one thing happening right now. We still have the reconciliation stuff, which my sense is that Democrats do not get how urgent it is to figure out what the final number is, pass it, and move on. So that's happening. And of course, we have the debt ceiling thing coming up again in, what is it? I guess 6 weeks. What, is it early December, something like that? Yeah, so not too far away. In any case, before we get started on that, let me remind you that Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee is a sponsor of the Josh Marshall podcast. Temperatures are dropping, leaves are falling, the sun is setting halfway through your lunch break, but for everyone on Team Cold Brew, it's still iced coffee season. If you're a proud year-rounder, it's time to put on your mittens, fill your tumbler with ice, and top it off with Grady's New Orleans-style cold brew. With regular and decaf options, you can finally enjoy velvety smooth cold brew all day, every day, even in the depths of winter. If you're ready to give it a try, get 25% off your first order at Grady's. Oh, wait a second. Get 20. It actually says, the new copy says, get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. So it seems like you can do this like a multiple orders. It's like changing even as I read it. So, Kate, what's going on all these different fronts?
Well, I guess to kind of clean up on reconciliation, right now, both chambers are in Congress. The House came back briefly on Tuesday to pass the Senate's debt ceiling extension. So that's fully kicked down the can is kicked down the road for a month and a half, like we said. But yeah, I mean, it feels kind of like there was a reprieve when Manchin's top line number leaked and he started talking about that publicly. And it felt like you could feel a palpable break in the tension among Democrats because they were like, okay, finally, we have like a starting point. We can negotiate, we can move. And all of that kind of goodwill that was capped off with Biden visiting the House, that has drained away, it feels like. And now we're back to mounting frustration at Manchin and Cinema because it keeps coming back to this top line number. I think the two of them are not necessarily on the same page from what we're hearing from like kind of trickle down reports. Neither of them will talk publicly about where they are. There was a quote that Politico had yesterday about Cinema saying to a fellow Democratic senator, I'm not going to tell you my specifics. I'm not going to tell Pelosi or Schumer. The White House knows where I'm at. Basically, we're just definitely just going to kind of fan the flames there. Um, so, we're kind of stalled out again. And some parts, I think it's because I think part of the reason why it's so hard to come to a top line number is because it's not clear what programs Cinema and Manchin will not allow. And that's important because they're also insisting the package be paid for. So, like with Cinema's, what now seems to be a total refusal to do the Medicare negotiating drug prices down thing at all. I mean, that was going to bring in a lot of money. And now that if she's taking that off the table, they've got to figure out something else. So I think the top line negotiations are a bit more fraught than just I will accept 2 trillion or I will not. But it's kind of like we've been seeing, it's this weird black box and it's hard to know what's going on. Most of the Democratic senators don't seem to know what's going on. And I don't know, after we got that memo that the goofy memo that Manchin and Schumer both signed, it kind of brings up questions of, is this by design? Is this Manchin just drawing it out as long as possible? One of his bullet points on the memo was, we will not start debating the reconciliation package until October 1st.
What is but I mean, it's obviously past October 1st now,
Right, but
but
I mean, we've just seen him already use this gambit to like kind of draw it
right.
out and seemingly to give Biff time to pass by itself and potentially mess up the process.
Right. Yeah, it's a very strange thing with the prescription drug price negotiation thing because universally across the board, all public opinion, all subjective experience by lawmakers, that is the most popular thing anywhere.
Mhm.
Not in the Build Back Better, anywhere. It is it's the most popular proposal anywhere in American politics. And to many of us, it's also a good proposal, but not all popular proposals are actually good policy. And so it's not even there's a certain argument, may not be a good argument, but there's a certain argument about if you're doing sending checks to people without means testing, if you're doing, subsidizing childcare, there are definitely people in the electorate who don't want to spend money on that. But this is like almost like unanimously popular. So it does seem like a good example of she is very tight with the pharma lobby, and this is their kind of sine qua non thing. And so she's against it. And as you say, it's not just, people think of it as like, okay, well, we'll be able to, um, you know, get prescription drugs for less, but it actually brings in a ton of money for the government. Or I guess what it actually does is it reduces the cost of things the government's going to have one way or another. So this um, to add insult to injury, this seems like a case where there's literally zero argument that this is about being moderate or trying to kind of thread the needle in Arizona. This is just her funders aren't for this, and so she's against it. She's going to stop it, and it not only means that we're not going to get this kind of good policy thing, but dramatically it also makes the making the numbers work for the whole bill much more difficult.
Right. Yep, exactly.
And she's
And
off in like Europe right now doing a fun. I mean, which is another thing. Like what? You're like you went to Europe to do fundraisers? Like there, that's not part of America. I mean, to be fair, lots of politicians raise. At least the idea is they're raising money among expats in Europe, so that's fine. Whatever. Uh, all I can like, I don't even have any sense if there's negotiations going on.
it's so funny because I'm trying to find out through these like roundabout ways. For instance, I've reported a bit on the CEPP, this which is like the crux of Democrats' climate plan, which it's still not at all clear if it's going to go through at all because Manchin's committee is in charge of crafting it. But I had some interviews this morning with some scientists who have been engaging with the people, Senate staff and the people who are writing it, basically just trying to debug the program, make it as good as possible. And I was like, okay, so from those conversations, did you have any sense at what point of the process they're at right now? Like, are they debugging? Is Manchin on board with this? Is it almost done? And he basically said, I can tell you that it's somewhere between being dead and being passed. And I was like, okay, got it. He was like, I have no idea. I have no notion of if they're just like working on this policy and then Manchin will swoop in and say, no, this is completely off the table for me, and that's kind of the way a lot of this has been operating. And a relatively recent thing that's developed that I have kind of a conspiracy theory about is that Bernie Sanders has kind of taken on this role of being the mouthpiece for Democrats' discontent. And, that's a natural role for Bernie, who's crotchety at the best of times. Like, he cannot communicate without being kind of like grumpy or righteously angry about something. But he's been doing it in this very, very un-Bernie-ish way, like holding full-fledged press conferences. He did a pen and pad with reporters on Friday that I went to, which is, when a senator will just like come into the press gallery and sit there with reporters and answer their questions and stuff. And it's all this very Capitol Hill trappings type stuff that is usually not really Bernie's bread and butter. But he's been doing all these things primarily to do two things: to kind of articulate the huge special interest push against this legislation, which is classic Bernie, but also to call out Manchin and Sinema for not giving specifics, for saying things like it's long past time where you need to say what you're against or what you're for. And my kind of mild conspiracy theory about it is I would not be surprised if he was acting on the marching orders of Schumer, of Biden, of kind of the leaders of the party, just because I think everyone else has been treating Manchin and Sinema with such kid gloves because they're so worried about pissing them off, about having them sink the package altogether, that I think it might behoove the leaders not to be the ones in the bad cop role, you know what I mean? So it kind of feels like all of that has been outsourced to Bernie, who's a natural person to do it, and he's kind of there keeping his foot on the necks of these two during this seeming kind of stalled out time. He did that pen and
Right.
pad right before recess. He did a call with progressives yesterday or the day before where he kind of reiterated the message. He's just kind of become the person that all these frustrations are channeling through, whose drumbeat is, we cannot make progress on this unless you tell us what you want.
Yeah, I mean, both of them are awful and all that. My fear here is that what is happening is that they've basically said, look, 1.5 is all we're doing. 1.5 is all we're doing. And whether it's progressives or just the rest of the caucus, that they see them. I mean, because I said in the intro, it's urgent. It is, the political tide is turning against the president and his party because nothing is happening. The program is not really getting less popular, but inability to act demoralizes people. It's feeding into it is what is bringing the president's numbers down. And the biggest driver of whether you have a good midterm or a bad midterm is the popularity of the president. So you really need to wrap this up. And I fear that again, whether you want to say it's the progressives or just kind of everyone who's not Manchin and Sinema, are doing is they are telling themselves they're holding tough. We're sticking to our guns, 3.5, and we know it's not going to be 3.5, but we're not doing 1.5, so we need to end up at 2.2 or 2 or whatever it is. But I fear what they are actually doing is delaying accepting the reality of the situation, that those two are going to keep this to $1.5 trillion. And that's awful, but it will not be more awful if you come to grips with that fact in 3 months. It will actually be more awful then. And when I say, does no one get the urgency? Some of that is just that it's a microcosm up there, and the people on Capitol Hill frequently lose track of the fact that it is entirely the political dynamic outside of Capitol Hill that defines reality for Capitol Hill. But the other thing is, if you want to move things ahead, the best way for you as a person who has a vote on Capitol Hill to move things ahead is to give up what you want. To say, okay, fine, 1.5 trillion, done. Let's move ahead. And obviously no one wants to do that. And that's very understandable. But again, I fear this is not so, at this point, it is not so much holding tough as being in denial about what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know if the broader caucus has received any kind of solid answer on that. It's going to be 1.5. Like, I think the lock jam might be happening higher up the chain of command. I mean, when Biden came to the House, 2 weeks ago, he basically told them, gird yourself. It's going to be 2 trillion. I was surprised that he gave specifics in that meeting, which leads me to believe that, Cinema has been talking to them, or that they had some kind of idea that that's where it's going to be. Because honestly, I think if the White House was like, okay, it's $2 trillion, we tried, they will not go higher, then it would move forward. But I think we're still at a place where maybe the White House hasn't accepted that, or congressional leadership hasn't accepted that, or hasn't gotten Manchin and Sinema to definitively say, okay, 2 trillion. Because
Right.
I really don't think that, even kind of the leaders of the caucus have been given that information or know that to be a fact.
Yeah, no, that's possible. I'm not. I'm. My point is just collectively
Yeah.
that there seems to be, or that I fear. I mean, look, I would love if they're kind of doing a hardball negotiation right now, and we're going to find out in a week it's 2.1 trillion, and you pass it all through, and awesome, great, fantastic. Uh, but time is really working against the Democrats right now.
Mm-hmm.
That is the truth. And each day that goes by, the chances of the whole thing blowing up get higher. And when I say the whole thing, I mean both bills, everything. The chances of that get higher. And the chances of a bad election result in November 2022 also get higher. And what is it? We're a couple weeks out from this gubernatorial election in Virginia, and on its own, excuse me, on its own, if you don't live in Virginia, I mean, whatever. It's not the end of the feud. The fate of the country is not bound up in who's the governor of Virginia, but it's a sign. And right now, it seems very clear that that race is pretty tight, in large measure because Democrats are demoralized. It's having an effect. And it may also be having an effect because a lot of Democrats, going back to the other point we mentioned, are thinking that their elected officials are again going to get rolled on this subpoena thing. Most people aren't paying too close attention to that. That's more of a kind of a people who are really, really plugged into politics, but it's also playing a role. So they don't have a lot of time. Time is really of the essence. They have to get this done.
Yeah. And I mean, they're basically without any kind of real deadline right now. They have October 31st basically as when this like surface highway transportation extension expires, but they could easily renew that. It's not really, it's more kind of an arbitrary, this, we would like to have things moving by this point kind of thing. But I do think on the timing point, when they get back next week, we're going to see, is the whole week going to pass and all we're going to get from lawmakers, negotiations are ongoing, we haven't, then someone's holding it up, right? Someone at that point is the reason why it's not going forward. And my understanding to this point has been because Manchin has articulated that he likes the idea of drawing out reconciliation or not doing it until 2022. So he's got no beef with a very slow, agonizing process. Who knows ever what Sinema is thinking or wants to do? And that's been my understanding to this point. But you're right. I mean, there does come a point where the rest of the caucus could say, okay, we're doing 1.5. And I think Manchin and Sinema would deign to allow that to happen. But I wonder, I mean, 1.5 is just almost a smack in the face to progressives. I mean, they came in wanting 6. It's nowhere near the halfway point. It's so adding insult to injury of what they already see as like robbing people of help and money and a safety net.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of arguments on the specifics of all these different programs that are involved, and they're various, right? There are lots of different. I mean, and this goes back to one of the other kind of agonies of this process is that when you've got a lot of popular things, you should be passing them one after another.
Right.
We're going to do a climate thing. Now we're going to do, a child tax credit. Now we're going to do this. Now we're going to do that. We're going to do, universal pre-K or whatever. We're not. We're not even getting into the specifics because they're backed into this reconciliation thing. But what you just described again is what I worry about. That is a very bitter pill, but that may be the reality of the situation. And saying how bitter it is does not make it less bitter. Does not does not doesn't necessarily change the equation. And again, I fear that what they are telling themselves is holding tough is denial.
Right. And the other kind of fruitless push happening in Congress, as we just learned, Schumer said that he is going to file cloture on the Freedom to Vote Act next week, which sets up the vote to surpass the Republican filibuster will be Wednesday. The co sponsors of the bill met on Thursday, and I talked to some of them afterwards. Warnock told me that they had finally gotten Republican proposals, basically edits to the legislation from Republicans who say they're potentially open to voting for it. He called them, quote, inadequate. So it doesn't seem like Democrats love them. But he wants to debate those on the floor. And Tester told me they're only currently talking to 5 or 6 Republicans, which is kind of like, well, they gave Manchin a month after this was introduced to basically court Republicans. They went with him to some of the meetings. The whole idea being like everything with Manchin and the filibuster has been, we just need to show him that their Republican support for voting protections is non existent, and then he will give up the ghost and let us reform the filibuster. That's kind of been the driving notional term. And now that I think they've gotten to the point where they're like, okay, well, we gave you the time to have these conversations. Now we're going to bring it to the floor. I see no way that it doesn't fail on Wednesday. But, my naive Kate earlier in the term would be like, and that'll show Manchin because he cares about voting rights. And old and cynical Kate now is like, and then nothing will happen and it'll stall out until people are like, again, another push, which will crash up against the filibuster. And that's that.
Yeah, I don't know because I part of me has this thought, or I had this thought more earlier in the year, that you know Manchin is not stupid. He sees the same reality that we see. He may not react to it the same way, but you know, he knows they're not going to get 10 Republican votes to move this thing to the floor. Um, and so the fact that he seems to have spent a month or so rewriting the thing, lobbying colleagues, blah 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 blah, that why would he waste his time? You know, does he know? Does he have some rabbit to pull out of his hat in terms of getting some Republican co-sponsors? Or is all the things we've said, but these there's one way you can do these votes and have it building towards something where I don't know, you're getting the public upset that the important stuff won't pass, blah 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 blah. Or maybe you're getting your Democratic colleagues, Manchin and Sinema, upset, like, oh, they're going to turn against the filibuster. But if neither of those things are happening, you just start to look stupid. Like, why are we doing this again? Like, okay, we're gonna have the vote. It's going to get 50 votes, and that is it. So what's the point? And I think that's the reality.
Yeah. So moving on to the January 6th committee, like Josh previewed in the intro, we're today, since we're recording a day after we usually do on Thursday, we're kind of butting up against the the Rubicon, the point of no return, I guess, because today we're supposed to have Bannon and Patel uh, deposed for the committee, and then tomorrow Scavino and Meadows are scheduled. Um, so we're basically reaching the point where if they don't show today, they are not complying with a subpoena. And the committee has been previewing for a couple weeks now that if these dates come and go, they're going to refer these people for criminal contempt of Congress and get the ball rolling there, which entails committee vote, full House vote, and then should the DOJ take up the case, it moves to the courts. So that's put a lot of pressure slash questions around, is this, will Garland kind of step up? How aggressive will he be? And Josh, I know you had a post about this, so curious to see where your head's at about it.
As you suggested, I'm assuming that the people in the House are going to pull this trigger. That they are serious about this, because they have. If they're not, they've put themselves in a terrible position, because they've threatened and threatened and threatened and said we're going to do it, blah 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 blah. I don't know why they would do that if they're not going to pull that trigger, and they certainly should pull that trigger, and all that stuff. So I'm fairly confident they will. I have much less. I just don't know about Garland. I think that um, on other related matters under Garland, things that go to um, you know a general aggressiveness in a political context, things about the ex-president, things about January 6th. I would say that most people who've been following this stuff are kind of not sure they think he's doing a bad job, but they're a little underwhelmed about how he's approached these things. And I'm concerned. I Is he going to turn around and I mean, because what is, like, let's say, and this is, Kate and I are recording this between noon and 1 o'clock, give or take, on Thursday afternoon. My understanding is that Bannon, and I don't know if it's Bannon and Patel, which of these guys, but Bannon and someone else supposed to show up this afternoon. Let's assume that uh, the House people make an immediate referral, and if not immediate, why not? I mean, we know what's happening. What's the point? And something similar with Garland. This isn't something new coming down the pike. Everybody knows what's happening here. I don't think there's no point for some, like, internal deliberation process. You might cross a few T's, but I don't know. I really hope that they will act on this, that he will act on this in an expeditious way, because I've done a few posts recently where I've talked about, you can't act in a way that makes a mockery of yourself, and you can't act in a way that makes you an object of contempt. And we are in a situation now where, when a normal person gets subpoenaed, they've got to show up. You can't just say fuck off. And there are, as I said, a complex set of reasons when it's a sitting president. It gets more complicated. That's not the case anymore. And so if it's really the case that the Congress of the United States cannot investigate when there is an armed attack on the seat of government, what can they do? And you make a mockery of the republic's ability, the Constitution's ability to defend itself. And so I don't know what Garland's going to do. You know, I fear he is one of these kind of kind of kick the tires. We have to be conscious of the precedents we set, all that kind of stuff. Um, all of which is those are all very important cautions. But when the house is on fire, you have to move deliberately, and the house is on fire.
Yeah, I mean, I would add here that this is not like a slam dunk case. I mean, so that's kind of separate from whether or not Garland should be aggressive about it. But, the law that kind of governs criminal contempt of Congress, I had looked it up. There hasn't seemed to be a successful prosecution under it since the late 70s. And as we've kind of seen, these questions that involve presidential privilege, no matter that in this case, it seems a bit more far removed, things like that. They haven't been moving very quickly through the courts. I mean, that's what's kind of bedeviled Democrats before, even though, the narrow kind of you defied your subpoena question does seem rather open and shut.
Well, why is it that what is it about the law that there haven't been why haven't there been successful prosecutions? Is that the courts just don't like the law, or what's the background there?
I mean, it seemed that like I think part of the reason why there haven't been the successful prosecutions is that like deals are often struck kind of before you get to the end. So I think that's part of it as well. We do have this piece that I'm sure listeners are aware of where Bannon is claiming executive privilege, saying that Trump asked him to invoke privilege, uh, even though he was not employed by the White House for years before January 6th. You know, so I mean, Schiff even has a bill that requires courts to decide questions of presidential privilege, like that would speed up that process. So, they can't kind of use the courts to drag this stuff out. But,
You know,
this is
there's
all just kind of weediness
there's
surrounding the
another
issue.
there's another issue here, and this is I'm disappointed it has not gotten more play in the news reporting about this. An ex-president doesn't have executive privilege. The way that this works is the presidency has executive privilege. So the current president, it's up to the current president what 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 they want to invoke privilege about. This is very straightforward in the law. Um, and obviously, Joe Biden is the president. Now, in practice, since presidents have institutional um, privileges they are trying to protect that usually transcend partisan differences, a current president, notwithstanding the party of the previous president, will often back that person up. And the way the system works is an ex-president has to basically ask the current president, say, "Hey, I want to exert executive privilege," and the current president does it on their behalf. Now, as I understand this, there's a particular law that has to do with stuff's over at the National Archives. I think if the current president says no, then under that law, the ex-president can sort of has 30 days to complain or something like that. But that is actually a case where even that law, I think the constitutionality of that law itself is dubious. An ex-president does not have these powers. An ex-president, the current president, is the one who is in charge of the federal government, is the executive branch, making decisions to defend it, to defend the office of the presidency. So this is pretty open and shut. the president, let alone someone who hasn't even worked for the president in years, who is in constitutional terms just someone he talks to on the phone. This is all like bullshit, basically. The only place that it gets a little more complicated is if you're talking about making this guy Kash Patel talk. Now, he's in charge of his mouth. Someone needs to compel him, right? But in a lot of these cases, we're talking about the records of the federal government. Those are owned by the federal government. They are literally in the possession of the federal government. And Joe Biden runs the federal government. So president can kind of keep resisting, but Joe Biden can just walk over to the National Archives and say, here they are. That's really how it works. They own the records. Trump doesn't have these records. There may be some other secret records he kind of kept in his back pocket. But these are the records of the federal government of the United States. And Joe Biden is in charge of those records. Possession's 9/10 of the law. And that's most of what we're talking about here. So all of this is all pretty open and shut. The president has no privilege. The presidency does. But that's up to Joe Biden. And Donald Trump knows where to get Joe, he knows where to call if he wants to ask for Joe Biden's help.
And I would say so far, the Biden administration batted down Trump's attempt to keep a certain tranche of documents shielded from Congress that's at the National Archives. We just saw 2 letters from White House counsel saying, with these documents, we are, not going to exert executive privilege on his behalf.
Now, are there documents that they have said they're open to extending him that courtesy?
They basically said this is a case-by-case basis. We're eager to work with January 6th investigators, but, kind of put guardrails on the thing to be like, don't take this as a carte blanche for whatever you want, basically.
Right. So but everything that has come before them, they have said okay.
Right. Yep.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, and look, they're any president, any presidency, they're not just going to want to say, oh yeah, you can see absolutely anything you want. So that's understandable. But again, we're collectively making a mockery of the Republic's ability to defend itself, of Congress's ability. Congress is the first branch of government. This isn't some kind of random fishing expedition. This is literally an armed attack on the Congress of the United States, the physical presence, the seat of government, the actual physical Congress of the United States, by a violent mob led by the president. If the Congress cannot investigate that and get access to everything it needs to find out what happened, then the whole thing is kind of a joke.
Yep.
It's as simple as that.
Okay, let's take some questions. First, we have a question from Ken, who's talking about the Senate Judiciary Committee report that came out with kind of surprisingly little fanfare, I think, last week. Despite the missing pieces, it's pretty unequivocal and bombshelly. Is it completely out of the question for Democrats to launch a new third impeachment process? He goes on to say, this seems to be the only way to bar Trump from seeking office again. In that context, isn't it worth it?
I mean, I would say no, just because we know the result of that impeachment, and he will not be. A third failed impeachment or a third failed impeachment trial, that just makes the process look stupid. If somehow you could actually have him barred from seeking office in the future, that might be worth, kind of going through that. But since we know it's not going to happen, why are we even, there's the country does not have time right now for doing things on principle. The country really needs results on all these fronts. So I let alone the fact that I think people would laugh, I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally of more of a get caught trying camp, that I think oftentimes Democrats are like, well, that's not going to work, so we're not even going to try, and end up shooting themselves in the foot. But in this instance, I'm with you. I mean, it's just Democrats have been doing a lot of things for messaging benefit that won't work. And we are getting to a point, especially with all the reconciliation stuff, where it just looks like incompetence at some point, regardless of the fact that the numbers are stacked against them. So, yeah, I'm with you on this one.
Okay.
Okay. Second question from Jared, who says, first off, can we just have a round of applause for John Tester? A Montana Democrat has just as much reason to be a pain in the ass as one from West Virginia, but he isn't. Why? Does he have some other command of Montana politics? Is he less insecure and needing to showboat, or does he just operate more in the background? Um, which I really liked this question, because I think the John Tester of this term has been absolutely like fascinating to watch. There was one quote, I don't know if you saw it, but a reporter asked him a question with the framing of like, are you going to be with Manchin on this? And he responded something like, be with Manchin? Are you kidding me? My wife would divorce me. Like, he's not even kind of tiptoeing around this. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that it's not that he never breaks stride with the party. I think he just does it in like a logical way that just doesn't stick in the craw the way that Manchin's does. Like, he voted against the 15% federal minimum wage boost. He never committed to Biden's alcohol, tobacco, explosives guy who ultimately got pulled. I mean, he does kind of take a stand when he thinks he needs to, but his is just, it seems to be a lot more kind of ideologically based and not so much what Manchin's doing, which a lot of the time feels like I must take a stand against the bulk of the agenda, against like not really picking off pet issues, but more being like, where is the party wanting to go? How do I obstruct that? That shows me to be bipartisan. And I think there was this really good quote from Tester in a profile just written about him, where he says, it's hard for Chuck right now dealing with the Bernie Warren faction and the Mansion Cinema faction. I don't want to add to that. They're going to hear me complain and bitch and holler and scream when I don't like it, but it's not going to be in front of you. And I'm going to be very specific in what I want. And I think that really just kind of boils it down well.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I mean, look, the first thing to say here is that John Tester's great. And I say that in the sense of like I just think he's great, but also he is a very canny
Mm-hmm.
politician. Notwithstanding all the I'm just back from the tractor kind of talk. Um Montana's a very red state, and he has, I think he is now in his third term. I think he's 2006, 12, and 18. So he's doing something right. And that's what a centrist or moderate actually is. There's some places he cannot be with the rest of the caucus on gun stuff, on some cultural stuff. That's just a reality. And his party gives him uh a fair amount of running room because they know he's from a pretty conservative state. But the basic difference is that he's not, he is seldom or never trying to wrong foot the party in public to make a point about himself. He's, you know, there's, as you said, there's, and if you look at all these negotiations, it's always, kind of Mansion and Cinema, but it's usually Testers there, kind of Testers in the mix. What do we need to do to kind of make sure he can be with it? But he clearly approaches things that he is trying to allow his party to get things done, basically the things they want to do. And when he can't help, he can't help. But he's not trying to his shtick is not, as I said, wrong footing the party to make points about himself. Now, I will say one other thing. In the original question, the questioner said, a Republican state like West Virginia. That's actually not true. I don't know the exact numbers, but Montana usually goes for the Republicans maybe by 10 points or something, like, a solid margin. It's in a whole different universe in West Virginia in the last several years. Trump, I think both times, and I think this actually goes back to uh, certainly the second Obama election, maybe the first. It's like 2-1. It's not close. There is a substantial Democratic electorate in Montana. I don't know if it's like 45-55, maybe 40-60, but Democrats get like 25% of the presidential vote in West Virginia. So just to be fair, Manchin, it's a different reality. They're not the same. I mean, again, big story. John Tester's great, but those are not equally Republican states.
I think that's true, but I also think, I mean, how many Democratic senators from red states did we see felled in, 2018 in the past few cycles? Like, I think you're right that uh, Republicans win bigger in West Virginia than Montana, but I don't think Tester is looking generally at like much safer of a seat than Manchin is when it comes time to vote.
Look, I agree that is why I said he is a very canny
Yeah.
politician,
Yeah.
because he works very well with his caucus.
Mm-hmm.
When he does have to oppose his party on things, he doesn't rush out to meet the press to make a big deal about it. And he's gotten reelected. I mean, 2012 was kind of a good year in the sense that had Obama. Um, it wasn't a midterm. He's running with we kind of say in retrospect now, popular president. Didn't seem so clear cut at the time, and that was a pretty close election. 2018, he you know kind of got lucky, right? The sort of the anti-Trump midterm. So he's been lucky, but he's we did Claire McCaskill go down in 2018? Did she lose in 20? I think she
Pretty
did. I think
sure.
that was
Yeah.
2018. He's a good politician.
Yep.
It's not easy to pull that off. That is not if memory serves, I think Obama came close to winning Montana in 2008, but he didn't. Possibly I'm wrong. Maybe he won. I'm pretty sure he didn't. Came close. It's a Republican state. You got to be pretty canny to pull that off, and he's
Yep.
done it 3 times.
Um, okay, and our last question is from Scott, who his question kind of is in line with your mantra on time, Josh. He says, you mentioned today on the site that Halloween deadline is a fake deadline, but don't Dems need an actual deadline? Nothing gets done in Washington until the end. Um, we recently learned of Manchin's deal not to negotiate until the beginning of October. Uh, is there any way to force a deadline on this? A senator could die, a natural disaster could distract everyone, some geopolitical event could happen. There are myriad ways this goes on forever as nothing. So, what can Democrats do? Basically, what
They
you're saying. How do you ratchet up
Yeah,
the pressure?
yeah, they need a deadline, and a senator dies suddenly. The deadline's behind you.
Right.
That's not a deadline. That's a deadline in the past that you didn't know about. And geopolitical event. We had that. That was Afghanistan, and it was like, yes, misportrayed, but it had a big effect. It weakened the president, and that has had a big effect here. I saw Representative Jayapal make a statement yesterday where she said something to the effect of, "Look, October 31st isn't set in stone. We can repass that highway stuff. There's no rush." And look, she's fighting the good fight here. It's all great, but she's wrong. Time is not on their side, and I really hope they grasp that, because yes, you do need a deadline. I mean, we've all seen kind of like I mean, maybe this is just showing my own cards, but it's like when you're in school and you're, oh, the term paper's due, and you're kind of up against it, and suddenly the teacher's like, okay, I'm giving you an extra week, and I was like, ah, great, gonna go out and party this weekend. And then suddenly it's you're down to one day again, and you didn't do anything with it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's happened here, kind of like, whatever that was, a week and a half ago. Everything goes down to the wire, and then suddenly, Mansion and kind of Cinema, it seems like they're negotiating, and everybody kind of, took a deep breath, and suddenly it's kind of, we're just floating in nowheresville again.
Right.
It's really urgent, and I hope they get that, and it's not clear to me that they do.
Well, I think Jayapal probably said that because I think she's afraid that there'll be another push to pass the bipartisan bill come the end of October, and reconciliation still won't be anywhere, and we'll be in the same scary situation we were in. But I mean, I agree with you, and I think if they wait until the last minute to do this, they're just setting themselves up for a situation where, again, they got to figure out how to do reconciliation, how to do it in tandem with bipartisan at the same time that the debt ceiling is coming to a head and a government shutdown is looming. And I know you're totally right. They're college kids with a term paper every time, but my God, if you can get reconciliation done just like a little bit early, I mean, they're just going to be clearing their plates in such a big way, and then they're going to have these other fights anyway. It's setting themselves up for such a unnecessarily higher pressure situation when you're going to have a more demoralized base than you've got now, and the midterms are going to be truly right around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. A the biggest driver right now of the president's diminished popularity is the strong impression that he cannot get things done. And Afghanistan was key in his, I mean, look, here's the progression of events here. Everybody's kind of feeling pretty good in the spring. We're getting this COVID thing behind us. We're moving forward. Then you have Delta and all the different things, and you still have all the supply chain stuff. We're back in COVID. Everybody's kind of, the country got in a bad mood of, ah, I thought we were moving forward. We're not moving forward. We're still stuck. What happened? And Afghanistan, I think, answered that question for a lot of people. Here's what happened. Joe Biden's not up to this task. He can't. He's a nice guy, but he can't get it done. Now, I think that is a wrong analysis on several different fronts, but that is what sent his popularity into a tailspin. And what we are seeing now is every day this same thing about they're trying to pass this thing, and they're talking about it, and nothing happens. That is hurting him a lot. And we talk about the midterms as, oh, it's, they're on the ballot. Midterms are about the president. So those people on the Hill are going to pay the price if people still have that impression of the president.
Yeah, and I mean it sucks because it's hard, and sometimes they'll say, 50 person majority, and it's like, totally, I get it, but you got to figure it out. I mean, before Georgia, probably a lot of people were guessing that there would be a Republican Senate, so it's better than at one point we thought it would be. So, I mean, you got to got to just get it done,
Well,
especially
and
just
that
I was just gonna say, I think most people are unable to comprehend the difference between trillions of dollars, even though, of course, that has practicable effects. And the progressives are absolutely right that Manchin and Cinema are like, robbing them of these transformative programs. That's definitely right. But the you're going to have a bill stuffed with a lot of programs that they're going to be able to sell regardless of if it only comes in at 1.5 trillion. And I mean, I'm with you. It's such a bitter pill, but at some point the choice is between that and more months of this. There's got to be a choice.
Yeah, I think they have to figure out very quickly, and it's hard to figure out because it's hard to figure out things you don't want to figure out.
Yeah.
But they need to figure out if 1.5 trillion is really what this is going to be, and if it is, they should just pass it and
Right.
just move through. And Kate and I were talking before we started recording that one of the things, there was one article in Insider this morning saying that what the Democrats are going to say is, we'll come back to some of this stuff in another reconciliation bill in 2022. Now, things get harder, not easier, as you're moving towards an election, especially one you don't think you're going to do well in. But whatever, you don't know the future. You can say, you can say that, and you should say that. And again, they've just got to figure it out and move forward. As I said, I fear that these people with the best of intentions have rebranded denial as hanging tough, and it's going to hurt them. So they need to move on.
And I would like to add that at least I am not saying this from the perspective of progressives always ask too much and don't get it and they're being unrealistic, because I think that is such like a classic DC bias that the moderates and centrists are the reasonable starting point, the progressives aren't. And that has specifically this term just not been true.
Yeah, it hasn't been 100% has not been true at all. This is not a matter of like it was unrealistic or you're being unreal. It's none of those things. It is the reality that there are only 50 votes.
Right.
And you can say till you're blue in the face that Joe Manchin and especially Kyrsten Sinema is terrible, but even when you've stamped a big terrible on their forehead, they're still going to have those votes. So this is not, they've got to compromise too. Those two are doing no compromising, but they have the vote.
Right.
Okay, on that positive note, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com if you use promo code TPM. All right. Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.